there anything you'd like to say before I pronounce sentence?
Maybe a little.
Yes, sir.
When this whole thing happened, like I've said it before in my statement, it's just very much the truth, so I'll just say it again. When this whole thing happened, all I ever really wanted to be was Blanchard. That's all I ever wanted to be. I've never known what it was like to have a motherly love. I've never known what it's like to have a female connection. I've never known any of that. None of it. Because I've never known it, that's part of the reason why I strive so hard to get it. So much to the point where I don't even understand what it even feels like to have a female connection. It's missing. It's a missing link. It's always been a missing link. It's always been one. And that's the reason why, I guess, when I got so deep into this situation where I fell in love so deeply, they do say, and they've always said it, love is blind. They've always said that. Well, I'll admit it, I was blindly in love. That was always very much the case. It was always that way. So, I understand that you're a fair judge. I've heard it from both my attorneys. And all I ask is just for mercy, please.
Is what?
Mercy of any form. That's all I ask.
Nicholas Godejohn confessed to the unaliving of Deedee Blanchards in her Springfield home in 2015. In 2018, a Greene County jury found him guilty on first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without parole, plus 25 years for armed criminal action. He has since filed several appeals following his conviction and sentencing. In August of 2022, Nick requested a new trial with a new attorney, arguing he'd previously had ineffective assistance of counsel and that Nick lacked the understanding due to his mental capacity. However, a judge denied this motion. In December of 2023, his public defender filed another appeal for a new trial, but there is reportedly no deadline for the court to deliver a ruling. So in this video, we're going to be going over some of the most important parts of Nick's appeal. This is not his newest appeal, but this has some great information about where the defense stands and how they believe his autism affected what happened. This is over a 50-page document, so I thought it would be best to just go over the parts that I thought were the most important that maybe the public doesn't really know. So if you'd like to pause to read these, feel free to do so. We're going to start with the statement of facts page. By the way, lots of my videos are getting flagged for some reason, so if I replace words with different words, please know that's why. So we're going to jump down here where it says defendant met victim's daughter GB through an internet dating site in October 2012. They began a secret romantic relationship because victim controlled every aspect of GB's life and would not let her have a boyfriend. GB told defendant that victim had forced her to pretend to be disabled to receive financial help and charity. By at least May 2014, defendant and GB had developed 3 different plans to try to get GB away from victim so they could be together. After a meeting between defendant and victim was unsuccessful, they decided on a plan that involved unaliving victim. Between May 27th and June 10th of 2015, Nick and GB sent each other electronic messages about the plan. In these messages, GB asked defendant about the items he needed to commit the crime. He chose a knife for the crime and also told GB he wanted duct tape to muffle victim. Defendant texted GB as he traveled from his home in Wisconsin to Springfield, Missouri, and informed her when he had arrived. On the night of the crime, GB texted defendant and told him victim had taken her sleeping pill. On June 10th, 2015, at 2:07 in the morning, defendant texted GB informing her he had arrived at her house and telling her to get into the bathroom. After entering the home and making sure GB was in the bathroom, defendant waited a minute and thought about if he, quote, really wanted to do it. After the schmurder, defendant and GB went back to the defendant's home in Wisconsin. On June 14th, 2015, authorities discovered victim's body laying in her bed. Victim died as a result of 14 stab wounds to the back. Now, during Nick's first trial, his attorneys argued that he had diminished capacity because he has autism and his IQ is on the low side of average. So Nick is basically filing an appeal saying that his attorneys basically didn't do their job and that they didn't present evidence from a qualified neuropsychologist who specialized in autism to help support that diminished capacity defense. In these documents, they're going to mention these two doctors. So this is Dr. Kent Franks. He was the psychologist that did evaluations on Nick. He testified on behalf of the defense. And then the prosecution brought in Dr. Robert Denny, who basically was trying to debunk anything that the previous doctor said. Second paragraph, line 2, while he was waiting for trial, defendant also made statements about the crime to a journalist. Both Dr. F for the defense and Dr. D for the state examined defendant prior to trial and testified at trial. Their testimony established that defendant has autism spectrum disorder and an IQ on the low side of average, but he could read and graduated from high school. The jury found defendant guilty on both counts, and the trial sentenced defendant to life in prison without parole and a concurrent term of 25 years in prison for armed criminal action. In his first point, defendant argued that the trial court abused its discretion, excluding proposed testimony of the defense psychological expert, Dr. F, regarding the effect the defendant's ASD had on his ability to deliberate at the time of the offense. In his second point, defendant argues the trial court abused its discretion when it permitted the state to call in Dr. D in rebuttal because the examination Dr. D conducted of the defendant prior to the trial was not authorized under Rule 25.06. Defendant argues he was prejudiced against because his primary defense was lack of deliberation due to his ASD. Both of these claims fail because there's overwhelming evidence of deliberation in spite of the evidence that the defendant had been diagnosed with ASD. And that overwhelming evidence is going to come from the text messages and messages back and forth with Gypsy where they were planning everything out. And then the interview he did where he told a reporter that basically he had like the devil and the angel on his shoulder and he thought about if he should do it or not for a minute. So that's probably what they're considering the overwhelming evidence that he did deliberate. Yeah, so that's kind of what they're going over in this top half here. And at the bottom we have amended motion claim A. So this is just the motion that he was denied effective counsel. Again, if you want to pause to read all of this, you can. This part is basically talking about how Dr. F is not qualified to testify as an expert in this case because he's not a neuropsychologist who has experience with ASD. So this part says that a neuropsychologist with experience in autism would have explained to the jury that GB's manipulation of Mr. Godejohn over 2.5 years, combined with Mr. Godejohn's ASD Asperger's, which would have negated Mr. Godejohn's ability to deliberate. A specialist would have explained that Mr. Godejohn's conditions caused him to surrender his deliberation to GB's logic because he took her statements as literal facts when she said that unaliving her mother was the only way they could be together and that it was up to him to rescue her. The amended motion explained that a neuropsychologist specializing in ASD Asperger's would have rebutted Dr. D's testimony that Nick grew out of autism into Asperger's and that he had a very mild form of the condition. If defense counsel would have investigated and called a specialist, the jury would have known that mildly autistic is misleading because mild refers to a person's superficial socialness to mask social dysfunction rather than the severity of the person's disability. The levels of autism correspond to how much support a person needs, and Mr. Godejohn did not receive the support he needed at home or through services in the community. And in this part, they're talking about how they would like to call a Dr. W, who is a pediatric neuropsychologist, to testify. And it says he would testify as follows. People with autism spectrum disorder are susceptible to other people's wishes and are ideal targets for manipulation. They often misperceive social intentions. Social impairment is one of the most prominent figures of ASD. Dr. W will testify that people at the high end of the spectrum, such as those with Asperger's, want intimacy, but have a very difficult time maintaining it. They also have a greater need for emotional intimacy, but have trouble maintaining it as well. People with ASD are tense and anxious about their relationships because their relationships often fail. Dr. W will testify that those with ASD have a lot of high emotional empathy with others, which parallels the emotional state of that other person. They are also unable to read facial expression and intentions. Dr. W will also testify that people with ASD are hyper-focused on narrow interests. They can't think about or do anything else and almost can't feel their own emotions because of it. A person with ASD will take everything that another person says at face value because they are so hyper-focused and don't pick up on social cues. Skipping down to paragraph 2, basically stating that because they didn't investigate and call a neuropsychologist specializing in ASD, that the jury did not otherwise hear evidence that Mr. Godejohn's autism played a role in his social relationship with Gypsy and her ability to manipulate him as a highly susceptible person. As it was, the prosecutor was able to argue in closing arguments that GD did not deceive Mr. Godejohn into unaliving her mother because she merely asked him and he made the decision. The motion further alleges that had a specialist like Dr. W testified, Mr. Godejohn would not have been convicted on first-degree murder. Pause to read the rest. We're going to move on. I'm going to move further down this page, so if you want to pause to read the top of this, go ahead. This part at the bottom is talking about Dr. F again and how he evaluated Nick to see whether or not he was competent to stand trial. He was, but he also looked into the diminished capacity, but Dr. F brought it to counsel's attention as something he had questions about. However, Nick's lead counsel did not have much experience with ASD. This part is talking about what both doctors testified at trial, how Dr. F said certain things about Nick's diminished capacity, but that Dr. D, who was, remember, the state's doctor, said that Nick's autism was more mild than the first doctor said. We're going to skip to page 18, so if you want to pause to read, these are pages 15. This is going to be page 16, Dr. W's testimony, which in the next pages I go over will cover what was said in his testimony. This is page 17, and then 17 continued. This is page 18 that states Dr. W testified that the levels 1, 2, and 3 of autism correlate to the level of disruption in the person's life and their inability to function within society. It refers to the level of support that an individual needs rather than the severity of autism. Regarding the term mild being used to describe autistic people, Dr. W pointed out that to be classified as an autistic person must be in the top 2% of the people who are being considered for the diagnosis. It is still a rare diagnosis, and a person has to be severely impacted at baseline to be considered autistic at all. The idea that someone could be mild and that most of the day it doesn't bother them or doesn't impact them is a misrepresentation of the word mild, because an autistic person's thinking is always characterized by their autism. In preparation for the Rule 2915 proceeding, Dr. W reviewed records, discovery, psychological reports, videos, and other information about Mr. Godejohn and the case. He interviewed Mr. Godejohn at the Potosi Correctional Center on March 25, 2022. He also considered the reports of Dr. F and Dr. D. After completing his evaluation of Mr. Godejohn, Dr. W found that Mr. Godejohn meets the criteria for the diagnosis of the autism spectrum disorder. Dr. W determines that Mr. Godejohn meets the criteria for moderate 2. Dr. W considered significant that Mr. Godejohn had a traumatic birth requiring intervention from difficulty breathing and the cord wrapped around his neck. The records indicated that Mr. Godejohn was placed on Social Security disability at the age of 19 due to ASD Asperger's. The records indicated a severe disruption of his ability to function in society, hold employment, have friends, maintain relationships, prepare his own food, and take care of his hygiene. He had problems grasping the real world and understanding the environment around him, which is typical for patients with the Asperger's form of ASD. When asked what he does all day, Mr. Godejohn answered that he goes to the computer, walks, eats, and sleeps. Dr. W noted that Mr. Godejohn was isolated. Mr. Godejohn reported that he gets frustrated with people and does not like crowds, which is typical for ASD. Dr. W discovered that Mr. Godejohn's condition affects every aspect of life, from self-care to general demeanor during the day and to social interaction. Needs for support were identified early on, and he was placed in a special education program for children with neurodevelopmental disorders. He went through 3 levels of intervention until he was receiving the most support available. His reading and writing skills were at a 4th or 5th grade level when he was 16 years old. The records indicate that the disorder has been all-encompassing for Mr. Godejohn's entire life. Records indicated to Dr. W that past relationships failed because Mr. Godejohn had trouble thinking. Mr. Godejohn could not look introspectively to say what went wrong, so he was not able to draw appropriate social conclusions. Like most people with Asperger's, Mr. Godejohn was desperate to have a relationship and went right back to find a new person without having learned from prior experiences. Dr. W testified that Mr. Godejohn met Gypsy Blanchard on the Christian Dating for Free website in 2012. After reading Nick's profile, Gypsy contacted him first. They messaged on the website for a day and a half before Gypsy suggested that they move to Facebook to continue their relationship. Dr. W testified, as is typical with autistic people, Mr. Godejohn did not initiate but was responding to the direction he was getting. Mr. Godejohn kept a journal between 2012 and 2015 that detailed his online relationship with Gypsy Blanchard. Dr. W testified that the journal reflects Mr. Godejohn's ASD Asperger's because it mostly recounts facts instead of qualitative emotional content. He wrote goodnight to himself once. He wrote, "Note to self, always keep Gypsy Blanchard close, for she is everything I wanted." He also noted that he and Gypsy were becoming in sync with each other by their communication. The journal reflects that the relationship was all-encompassing for Mr. Godejohn. Dr. W reviewed the large number of videos that Gypsy Blanchard sent to Mr. Godejohn and the ones that Mr. Godejohn sent back. The videos span from February 2013 to May 26, 2015. Also communicated with Nick from her, quote, demon love slave account. In many of her videos, she was depicted in role-playing personas as well as being naked, and they both took turns being dominant and submissive, or master and slave. Gypsy told Mr. Godejohn when it was his turn to be master or slave. Dr. W found that the videos from Gypsy to Mr. Godejohn were instructional videos. Autistic people receive their information about the social requirements of relationships from the structure of videos rather than the outside world. Mr. Godejohn was receiving his information about the requirements for his social relationship from the videos and not from anywhere else. The various personas were feeding Mr. Godejohn's instructions. On the subject of love, for example, she instructed to him, "If you love me, you will do this. If you love me, you will do that." The instruction videos demonstrated how to STAB somebody. They were instruction videos that told him what his rewards would be for appropriate behavior, and they were instructional videos that told him what the punishment would be for the behavior that the persona did not like. It was a process of shaping a person who had social deficits into action of some form that would demonstrate his love for her. Dr. W testified that the video would affect Mr. Godejohn differently than a non-autistic person because the videos would totally define Nick's reality. There would not be a separate Nick out in the real world who would second-guess his role-playing. When he was in the role-playing situations, he was totally there. He was totally there in an instructional setting where she set the ground rules for how he was to relate to her. Dr. W found Gypsy's videos to be fascinating because each role had its own set of rules. So you had Demona, that was the master, who was telling Nick that if you do what I want you to do, there will be sex, and there will be favors. If you don't, there will be punishment. I will take away Gypsy, and then we have this later character introduced that basically shows up in a red wig and gives him instructions about how to hurt people, and that we're going to rob and steal and all of the rest of the stuff. And there is actually a video of this circulating. I can find it and post it if you haven't seen it. So these were, as it was to me, it was just a very organized attempt to manipulate someone who didn't have the social judgment to really suspend belief. Dr. W testified that the role-playing is the primary way that people with ASD use to build relationships with others. The actual physical and social interaction with people is too threatening and has too much information, so they can't process it. There are treatment programs that are based on role-playing online games. People like Nick are still autistic even when they are role-playing and losing themselves to the characters. After reviewing all of the videos and messages between Gypsy and Mr. Godejohn, Dr. W concluded that for the most part, it was a process of shaping Mr. Godejohn. It was a process of taking a person with a social deficit and shaping his behavior by sending the instructions, and that if he loved her, he would do what all of her personas asked him to do. Dr. W testified that Gypsy was Mr. Godejohn's hyper-focus, and she made herself conditional upon his doing what she said. It was part of the process of indoctrination, which is well established in psychology and the military. It is typical for people with Asperger's to have hyper-focused periods of time. Taking her away would be very threatening and upsetting to him. Dr. W received the text messages between Gypsy and Nick from the night of the schmurder. He found that they were a continuation of the pattern where she gives him instructions. The 2 years of role-playing were a foundation for the events that took place the night of the schmurder. They were part of a programming a person with autistic disorder to follow instructions and engage in a behavior based on the fact that he would lose his object of fascination if he did not. In one video, Gypsy went into her mother's bedroom and made a STAB motion over the bed. I think they made a typo here, but it says it was significant to Dr. W because it was a demonstration of how Mr. Godejohn was supposed to engage in the behavior that would up in the unaliving of the victim. The video was dated about 3 weeks before the schmurder. About 3 days later, Gypsy sent Mr. Godejohn another video called Ruby's Introduction to Her Perfect Man. Ruby was a new character GB introduced to Nick. Ruby introduced herself as a sociopath. She says that she herself is a person that breaks the rules, violates the rules, creates mayhem, and she basically tells Nick that she is the perfect match. We are together, and together we are going to go. We are going to go on essentially what she describes as a crime spree, and we're going to rob, we're going to steal, and we're going to do all of these things because you are my perfect match. We will be together. Dr. W reviewed the interrogation videos from when Mr. Godejohn was arrested. When Mr. Godejohn was waiting for detectives to arrive, he periodically mentioned he was worried about Gypsy. He was still fixated on her at the time, and an autistic person will do anything to get their fixation. Dr. W testified that multiple times GB turned down Mr. Godejohn's proposal to run away instead of committing schmurder, which is part of the process of the training. She eliminated alternatives until the only option left was what she wanted him to do. When Mr. Godejohn arrived in Springfield on the night of the incident, it was his intention to talk GB out of it and run away. He did not bring anything with him, and GB provided it all to him. He tried to talk her out of it, but he was not able to because she said there was no other option. Dr. W testified when Mr. Godejohn was walking to the victim's room, he was having an argument with himself, which is typical of someone on the spectrum because they get overwhelmed and overstimulated. The argument in his head leads to autistic panic. When the autistic person does not think well, they panic when things get out of their control, and sometimes they are hospitalized for it. It is a typical reaction when they feel pressured by competing things or things outside of their control. Like the experts at trial, Dr. W was not allowed to testify to the ultimate conclusion on the element of deliberation. Okay, just for time's sake, I'm going to skip over this part. If you guys would like to pause to read the rest of this page, please do so now. I'm going to skip the top half and we're going to go to the very bottom because this says at about a month before the incident, Nick told a Facebook friend that me and the one I'm with are defying the laws of nature to stay together. It is as bad as can be. I won't tell you what I have to do to stay with her, but I will do it if it means keeping her. And then I don't think I can even say this on here. So read this bottom half of this too, and that's going to be the end of page 25. This top part is about that argument that Nick talks about where he had the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other, and then further down it talks about the plea offers that he was offered. So it basically says Mr. Godejohn was open to a plea deal but rejected the specific offers because he was hoping for a sentence closer to the 10-year sentence that GB received. So this is the bottom half of that. This is going to go into the findings of fact and conclusions of law, and then the rest of this is basically like a summation of the previous trial and just reiterating everything that we kind of went over. So in this video description, I will put a link to where you can view all of these in their entirety if you'd like to read them all for yourself. So let me know what you guys think about this in the comments. I just feel, in my opinion, that Nick should be in some sort of mental health facility rather than prison where he can actually get the help that he needs. But I'm just wondering what his defense will argue, especially since this last appeal was denied. So I'm just wondering what they're going to bring to the table this time. So let me know what you guys think about this. I also have like over 400 text messages between Gypsy and Nick that were the week leading up to the incident that I could go through and make a video about. If you guys are interested in that, just drop it down in the comments and let me know.